Welcome to Gross Domestic Problem, the podcast that tackles America's biggest and most urgent crisis head on. The economy is on the brink. Americans feel it. But what if the real cause of the squeeze in their bank account, like an iceberg about to sink a ship, was mostly invisible? That iceberg? The national debt. Every episode of this show will be focused on unveiling this slow motion disaster. How do we get here? What happens if we don't get it under control? And what's the least painful way out? And what do we do in the meantime? There is no do-nothing solution, and every solution will require some sacrifice. But refusing that pain for ourselves means handing it on to the future with little to no control over who it hurts. And if you're like us, that's unacceptable. So let's dive in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this very special episode of Gross Domestic Problem. I, as always, am your grateful host, William Glass. I'm the Policy Director of the Millennial Debt Foundation and a lover of long-form conversations. You might say that I enjoy long walks down the conversational beach. So I'm thrilled to be doing this episode today, and it's going to be a special one because our guest in my worldwide virtual studio is me. Why in the world would that be? Well, I had some great fan feedback over this past weekend saying that from people who were loving the show, that what wasn't really coming out in the wash was, why am I doing this? All of my guests get plenty of time to wind their professional narrative and their biography together. And what becomes clear is for all of them why this matters. I especially think of Romina Baccia's episode where she talks at length about what it was like to grow up in Germany and visit Italian family members and experience the frontier between a well-run, responsible economy and a less well-run economy, and what that meant for people that she loved and cared about. And that really meant a great deal to me. And I realized that my fans and listeners are absolutely right, that this is a thing that needs to be remedied. So that's what we're up to today. Basically, what I wanted to talk about is how I think about this issue and why I'm involved in it, because I've got a lot of things going on. There are lots and lots of ways I could spend time, and this is a less than intuitive one. So why? And I thought, as I say, it might be good to start with what I think about the national debt in the first place. And when I think about this problem, I don't, for example, it has to be said, think first of like this sort of thing. The New York Stock Exchange busily hustling traders going here and there and moving big amounts of money around. It is true, in fact, that U.S. government debt is an asset that is traded on the stock exchange, and that has derivatives of it traded on the stock exchange. But that's not where my mind goes. And I should say, by the way, this is going to be an episode that should be consumed at least partly on YouTube or something, because there's going to be a show and tell element of this. There's nothing I can do about that. I'll try to narrate it, but I want people to see it. But I don't think about this primarily. I also don't think about the number, though the number is enormous and growing and dwarfs even this gigantic figure. I don't think about this, even though I do spend a great deal of time in this building and around this building, the nation's capital, working with legislators and lawmakers and their staff and trying to convince them educate them about the consequences of irresponsible fiscal policy and just how possible it is to make a better choice. I do spend a great deal of time here, but when I think about the national debt, this is not where I go. I go here. This is the trailer in Plant City, Florida, where I grew up, or at least one of them. I grew up in several because we never lived anywhere for very long, but this was one of them. Before I went to school here at the University of Florida, before I followed that school by going to more school here at Duke or here at SMU, before I started a company and sold it, before I joined the Millennial Debt Foundation, before I became an investor with a family portfolio that I was managing, before all of that, I started here in this trailer in Central Florida. And you'll notice if you look at it that there's like a trailer width missing there. And that's because this trailer, this window towards the left, about a third of the way in from the left, that was my bedroom right next to, as you can see, the bathroom where we had that vent window, but this was my bedroom. And I was shaken violently awake one night by an explosion that I later learned it happened next door, because the geniuses in that trailer who were cooking meth back before the Chinese taught us, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, how to make it well. Before then, somebody had put too much of something or too little of something else into the mix, and they'd exploded the trailer, and it shook me awake in the middle of the night. That happened in this neighborhood. It took longer than I'm proud of for me to realize that one of the trailers in the neighborhood had different women and men sort of walking in regular cycles. It was longer than I'm proud of that it took me to realize that I had a brothel in my neighborhood. Drugs were sold in this neighborhood. Violence happened in this neighborhood. When I came home from school, often I would have a bike chain wrapped around my fist because anything could and everything did happen in these neighborhoods. They were gutted of economic opportunity, gutted of promise and the chance of prosperity. And so people did what desperate people do. And also evil people preyed upon those desperate people. And this is where I started my life. I went to school here before it was a magnet school, when drugs were being sold and bought by middle schoolers in the hallways of this school. I was born at this hospital, Tampa General Hospital, and I was born months early. I showed up at a very, very robust 3 pounds. I showed up weeks and weeks and weeks too early. That followed me around for the rest of my life, although maybe there are people who know me who would question whether that's true. But I started here, and if it weren't for the grant that somebody gave my mom that paid for what I think was $750,000 in medical expenses in the early 80s. If it wasn't for that, my mother couldn't have afforded any of it. I don't know where we would be. We would have been much worse than it actually was. Maybe I wouldn't have survived. Maybe I would have had long-term developmental deficits that would have followed me forever. I don't know. But I do know that this is where I started. And the reason I bring it all up is because when people talk to you, when people talk about the national debt, there's always a suspicious peanut gallery out there that suspects that it's all a fig leaf for gutting entitlements or destroying our social safety net. And what I am telling is the story of a life where my native habitat was the social safety net. Everybody I knew was on some kind of dole, whether it was the welfare system or Medicaid or disability or Social Security or incarceration, which is directly paid for by government funding, there were lots of. My mother was incredibly stubborn and proud, and so she worked at times 3 jobs while going to night school to keep us under these rickety roofs in neighborhoods like the one that I just described. And yet, even then, the last mile of our safety and security was often publicly funded because of things like the school lunch program, there were times when the school lunch was the main meal we had in a day. I am deeply devoted to these programs, and I deeply care about them, and I absolutely want them to be there for people who need them. And the dirty secret about this national debt thing is that it will undermine in the long term our ability to do these things for the people who need them the most, the people who live in neighborhoods like the one I grew up in. When the national debt causes a crisis for this country, it will not affect people like the person I am now, but it will absolutely affect people like the person I was growing up, like my mother, who was working so hard to protect us and keep us safe and give us what we needed the best that she could. When I think about the national debt, this is what I think about. I think about the long-term slow motion disaster that we are headed to. Anybody who's listened to this show's intro will have heard me mention the metaphor of an iceberg about to sink a ship. I think about the Titanic a lot when I think about the national debt, and specifically when I think about people who accuse people who care about the national debt of either sinister, cynical motives or hysteria. And the reason I think about it is because what happened on the night that the HMS Titanic was sunk was that the captain and first mate were tricked. It was a clear night with not much moonlight, calm seas, which created an optical illusion that caused them not to see the iceberg until it was too late. And when they pulled up on the iceberg, they immediately thrusted the engines into reverse and then engaged in a hard port turn. And they thought that they had made it. They thought they had avoided the iceberg. But as they made their turn, a piece of the iceberg that stuck out from under the water ripped the starboard portion of the ship, near the bow, and caused a massive flood of water into the forward compartments that tipped the ship up just like this. In our case, we're being tricked in a different way, because it's not like the iceberg is going to appear out of nowhere. People have been calling out the iceberg for 30 years. They've been pointing out that the iceberg is there. It's ahead. We know exactly what it looks like. We know what its shape is. We know what it looks like above the water and under the water. We know exactly how much we have to turn the ship to avoid it. And we are not. And even if, this is to my friends who like to accuse people who care about the national debt of a kind of hysteria, even if it won't affect everybody like this, even if people like me are going to survive, people like me as a child, and the family and the system and the community that I grew up in will not. These people will experience a debt crisis like this. And that, to me, is morally unacceptable. I think about icebergs and ships. I think about captains of ships. I think about Admiral Mike Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And back when the national debt was a paltry $13 trillion, Admiral Mullen could be heard saying things like, the number one threat to our national security is not any terrorist cell. It's not any hostile force. It's not any army or any number of soldiers anywhere in the world. The number one threat to the United States national security is our inability to get our fiscal house in order. And in case people would like to accuse Admiral Mullen of hysteria, which plenty did, I'd like to point out the incredible work of the Scottish historian Neil Ferguson, who has painstakingly chronicled the relationship of great powers to debt and shown that over time, debt service, what he calls Ferguson's limit, is the point where in a nation's history, a nation or a great power's history, the cost of servicing debt, so principal plus interest payments, outpaces national defense spending. When that happens, the cost of challenging that great power is less, and the anticipated reward is greater. And that's true for everyone. And he says it's very important, it's a crucial point that Ferguson makes, that when a country pays more for its national debt service than it pays for national defense, that is a public signal of weakness that entices challenge. And I wish I only had to talk about national security. But the problem with our debt is that there is no do-nothing solution, and something has to be done, because the majority of U.S. debt is held by investors, foreign and domestic. And no one is holding a gun to those investors' heads. So they don't have to continue to buy our debt. And if they don't buy our debt, the only other solutions are that we buy our debt or we experience a fiscal crisis. And if we buy our debt, we unleash a wave of inflation on the economy that will dilute the purchasing power of everybody, everyone. But inflation is a tax. Inflation is a massively regressive tax because it's an inflation on cash purchasing power. So it hits people most who spend the most. It hits this. There's no do-nothing solution. And a lot of the solutions that get floated to deal with national debt are not serious. The idea that we could sort of just tax the rich, make millionaires and billionaires pay their fair share. This year, we're set to run a $2 trillion deficit in peacetime with a good economy. And if we were to use every single one of the most commonly floated tax avenues to tax the wealthy, we might raise as much as 2% of GDP, somewhere between $500 and $600 million. That's a quarter of the spread that needs to get covered. If we taxed the rich, if we tax them at 100% tax rate, we might get to a third or maybe a little more than that. There is no tax-only solution to this, and people who say there is are just not being serious. In fact, revenues have held pretty steady over the last 70 years. What has grown is our spending. This graph here shows taxes as a percentage of GDP, and yes, there have been significant tax cuts. The Bush tax cuts, you can see this line right here, this downward slope, but it's made up for in subsequent years, and then there's another slope, and then it gets made up for, and then the Trump tax cuts had a less profound effect than the Bush tax cuts, but then there are some dynamic effects that created more or less stable tax base, right around 18, 19%. While spending has gone from 20% of GDP to 27% of GDP in the same time. We do need to get serious about taxes. We can't just cut taxes anytime we want to. I don't like taxes. I pay too much. Most people think they pay too much. But it's the cost of doing business in a world with all of these things. And in reality, we can't simultaneously cut taxes and grow spending. If you look at my episode with Andrew Lautz, you'll see that was a thing that he was extremely clear about as a sort of universal truth of tax economics. We do not tax enough for our spending appetite. Something must give. And the thing is, everybody wants something to give that they don't care about. Everybody, you hear this commonly, right? I think Bernie Sanders has said it within the last few months in debates over the deficit, that we should just cut defense spending. Well, the truth is, we have cut defense spending. We've cut it a lot. In fact, every other kind of spend, we've cut defense spending. We've cut non-discretionary defense spending, which is things like foreign aid, Department of Education. What we haven't cut is a whole part of the budget. In fact, 3/4 of the budget that actually doesn't get voted on ever. It's so-called mandatory spending. What mandatory spending just means spending on autopilot, spending that doesn't get voted on by Congress. And I will hand it to the architects of mandatory spending platforms. They have done a phenomenal job ensuring that the dollars that they get don't go anywhere. Now, the problem with this is every time anybody wants to deal with mandatory spending, famously, Paul Ryan tried to do this. And what immediately happened is old age advocacy groups created ads that were videos of Paul Ryan pushing your grandmother off a cliff. And those videos, of course, are ridiculous because actually the truth about these mandatory spending programs is that the vast majority of benefits go to people who do not need them. So in actual fact, the wealthiest generation in the history of the world receives the overwhelming majority of benefits that are paid for by younger generations who are also inheriting the national debt that they have left us. This is what got me involved in the national debt from the standpoint of a generational stewardship issue, realizing this was a thing that millennials were going to get stuck with, so we had to figure out how to solve it. And solving it might mean pissing off some of our ancestors a little bit, but honestly, most of them can afford it. And secondly, just again, because I already know literally just the last few minutes are going to rouse in somebody's mind the suspicion that I just don't care about people who are poor or needy. I would just remind them that is my native habitat. And I'm very, very proud of the people who scratched and clawed and stitched things together so that I could survive. And yes, they got help, and I want that help to be there. It's exactly that help that is undermined by the possibility of our incapacity to pay our bills. By most estimates, the Social Security Trust Fund is set to run out sometime within the next decade. When it does, benefits to all beneficiaries will be cut by a third. Automatically, statutorily, it's in the law. Now, the law can change and people will change it. And when they change it, I suspect that what they'll do is they'll push benefits towards people who need it the most, and they'll take benefits away from people who don't need it as much. And all the thing I'm saying is that that's going to be easier to do today than a decade from now. It's going to cost more to do then. It's going to have less effect then. We're going to have to do other and more painful things. The cost of delaying responsible choices on the national debt grows with time. And the largest generation of retirees ever is going to finish retiring within the next few years. So there won't actually be much to do after that point. This is an urgent issue. It's a right now issue. And that's why I have focused the time and energy that I have on making sure that people who make voting decisions know the truth from the lies, the truth from spin, the truth from health scare, going back to my episode with Mark Goldwine, the truth from propaganda. There are difficult decisions that have to get made, but if they are not made, we will see a crisis in this country that will hurt the people who can least afford it most of all. On the other hand, if we decide to take seriously the call to stewardship, we have the possibility we actually can make a difference that will allow us to set our fiscal future on a more stable path. Millennial Debt Foundation has a list of policy proposals. I would encourage you to check it out at millennialdebt.org/debt-recommendations, or just go to millennialdebt.org and then follow your nose until you see them. But these policy recommendations, they're not the only ones. There is no shortage of good ideas on how to do this. What there is a shortage of is the political will and the ethic of responsibility to do it. And the reason that lack is there is because politicians are incentivized to go for the people who vote, to listen to the people who vote, to listen to the people who show up in disproportionately large numbers, and to follow lobbyist dollars. And all of those are weighted towards the elderly against the young. I have no desire to see any elderly person who needs the safety net unable to access it. But the fact is, we have people who are accessing a bloated system, and until we do something about that, then we will fail in our obligations to the future. That is why I started this show. Everything has to be on the table. This problem is too urgent for anybody to shift all of the pain of a solution to the other side. Later on in a coming episode, you're going to hear from former Congressman Reed Ribble, whose Save Our Social Security Act was and remains. I've heard lots of people. He served in Congress 8 years ago, and I've heard people in DC as recently as last week say that when we have to eventually solve Social Security, Reed Ribble's plan will be how we do it. And one of the geniuses of that plan is that Reed Ribble, a Republican from Wisconsin that he was, knew that there would be no long-term solution if everybody didn't share the pain. And if there's not political will to do that, we'll never engage. We'll never voluntarily suffer that pain, and we must if we are going to survive. So that's what I'm in it for. I'm in it for the people I grew up with. I'm in it for my people in Central Florida. Shout out. I'm in it for because I know that a social safety net being there when it was needed is the reason why I started there and ended up with 3 degrees and a high net worth and a family and a child who doesn't have to worry about her future. Has every opportunity open to her. That change happened in a generation because the safety net was there when it was needed for the person who needed it. And it's that we must protect by securing the fiscal stability of this country. Thank you all so much for being with me on this special episode. I am so thrilled to be on this journey with you, and I can't wait to share further conversations that are coming up in coming days with you all. Everybody have a great day. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform, and don't forget to subscribe to the show. Want to dig deeper? Follow us at millennialdebt.org for more insights, updates, and ways to be part of the solution. Thanks for listening.